Ukrainian intelligence operatives detected and destroyed the Russian Valdai radar system. The enemy had disguised it at the Dzhankoe airfield and temporarily occupied Crimea. Intelligence noted that this expensive system was hunting Ukrainian drones.
But the enemy's troubles don't end there. On October 18th, in the temporarily occupied city of Berdyansk in the Zaporizhzhia region, a fuel and lubricants depot was hit. Local telegram channels reported a fire. We're on it. Department of Active Operations of the Main Intelligence Directorate of Ukraine on Telegram.
The General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine counted 133 battles along the entire front line since the beginning of the day. In the Konstantinivka direction, the defense forces repelled 12 Russian attacks. Another 17 enemy assaults were stopped at the Oleksandrivka bridgehead. There, the Russians tried to advance in the area of 11 settlements. And on the Sloviansk section of the front, the Russian army tried 8 times to push Ukrainian defenders from their positions. The heaviest fighting is taking place in the Pokrovsk direction. In this section of the front, Russian occupiers have tried 55 times since the beginning of the day to break through the Ukrainian defenses. According to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, the defense forces are holding back the enemy's onslaught in the area of 11 settlements. In southern Ukraine, the Russians have increased the number of strikes with guided aerial bombs. This was reported by the Southern Defense Forces. Over the past day, the invaders dropped more than 20 aerial bombs on Ukrainian positions. In addition, about 9 FPV drone strikes were recorded in the southern directions, most of them in the Orikhiv and Huliapol sectors of the front. Analysts suggest that the Russian army is trying to make a breakthrough so that Putin has so-called military trump cards and can bargain for Ukrainian territories in possible negotiations with Donald Trump. Since the start of the full-scale invasion, Russian army losses at the front have exceeded 1,131,000 people. Of these, according to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, 890 occupiers were eliminated in the past day. In addition, the defense forces destroyed 2 tanks, 45 artillery systems, 1 air defense system, and nearly 400 drones, as well as 100 units of enemy vehicles.
Igor Alexandrovich, we just watched the situation in Pokrovsk, how the sabotage and reconnaissance groups operate, and how the defense forces are driving them out methodically and quite effectively. And I would like, with your help, to compare the situation in Pokrovsk and in Kupiansk. There, too, the situation is threatening. Sabotage and reconnaissance groups are infiltrating, again, slipping through 1 or 2 at a time, as they say, infiltrating. So, to what extent can we compare the situation there, in Kupiansk and in Pokrovsk, and how significant is the threat to the Ukrainian armed forces grouping located on the eastern bank of the Oskil, since the logistics route runs through Kupiansk? And how serious is this threat to the capture of Kupiansk, which is a key railway junction?
The situation is difficult in both places. I mean in Pokrovsk and in Kupiansk. Well, the positions are different, since these are still different settlements. And in Kupiansk, the enemy managed to enter from the northwest. In Akulitsia, fighting is taking place directly from that side, already inside the city. And in B, the situation is becoming threatening for the group that is located to the east of Kupiansk and Kupiansk-Zlovaya. At the very beginning, the enemy here planned and organized their offensive actions taking into account that it is necessary to capture exactly these 2 settlements, because Kupiansk-Zlovaya is a major railway junction, and they needed it, and still do now, in order to organize logistics in the future and use the railways. They widely use this kind of approach. And there is a threat here. Moreover, they are gradually restoring this railway line, this branch, in the direction of Kupiansk-Zlovaya. The idea is that if there is a chance to capture Kupiansk as well, they will need minimal time to bring it into combat-ready condition. And if the threat in Kupiansk is primarily in the northwest part, and the fighting is happening in that direction, then in Pokrovsk, as we know and can see from the assessments, especially from our servicemen under tactical level command, the main directions are south-southwest and west. But overall, it's the Kupiansk-Myrna-Red agglomeration. The danger is forming, and the enemy is acting from 4 directions. In the northeast, it's Dobropilia, as is known, where there was a raid and our defenders split their advance in that sector. But later, the enemy transferred reserves and reinforcements here and is still trying to take control of the road. From Dobropilia to Kramatorsk. That's generally in the northeast. Myrna-Red is under attack. This is a general defensive stronghold, the Kupiansk-Myrna-Red node, from the eastern side, with the aim of advancing further directly toward Pokrovsk from the east. And from the west, the enemy is trying to advance north of Kupiansk. In order to directly cut off the remaining logistical routes to our units and forces operating directly in the city. That's why the situation here is threatening, and events are unfolding from 4 directions around Pokrovsk and Myrna-Red.
Iyar Oleksandrovich, we also want to discuss the situation in the south with you. It is known that the Russians have increased the number of KAB strikes in southern Ukraine. This was reported by the representative of the Southern Defense Forces, Vladislav Voloshin, and he said that in just one day, the occupiers dropped more than 20 aerial bombs on Ukrainian positions. In addition, about 900 FPV drone strikes were recorded in the southern directions. And most of them were in the Orikhiv and Heliopol sectors of the front, according to Vladislav Voloshin. I want to know your opinion. Is this, let's say, a tactic and an attempt at psychological pressure, this increase in activity, or should we consider it as preparation for broader operations by the enemy? First of all,
Well, the factor of moral and psychological pressure has been, is, and remains. The conduct of hostilities is very important and significant, but here the enemy is exerting direct military pressure and advancing. And if we look at the Zaporizhia direction, what's important is their actions along the line of contact in the western part, on the left flank. There, they managed to capture Kupiansk, which is on high ground. This settlement is now held by the enemy, and they are advancing towards Stepanohursk, with attempts to outflank this settlement and advance even further north of it. This is at a distance of just 25 kilometers from Zaporizhia itself. And there is a road here from Stepanohursk to Zaporizhia. So, this left flank is quite threatening. It looks that way in the Orikhiv area. In the southern direction, relatively speaking, but we also know they are strategic. Assessments of the situation. Putin is trying to bargain, putting forward corresponding proposals. This is something new that's actually just the well-forgotten old, or, in other words, he supposedly puts forward approaches related to the idea that they should be given. Donbass, both regions, Donetsk and Luhansk. Luhansk, unfortunately, has been practically captured, and in exchange, he plans to make some concessions in the Kherson and Zaporizhia directions. But this is just spinning things, playing along with the American side in this situation, really more than anything substantial. That's why the enemy lately, considering that. But in terms of combat operations, they might hide, attack, and use mechanized units here to speed things up, even though they're vulnerable in such weather conditions, especially considering the effectiveness of our drones, particularly in the so-called death zone in the Kiev area. That's the situation.
Igor Alexandrovich, so. Now, thanks to this tactic of seepage, infiltration, we're already learning these terms. The second army in the world is a master at seeping through. In your opinion, what will this infiltration look like during the fall-winter period? After all, the enemy was largely helped by the greenery, but now the situation is different. How will this play out if not in the cities? Because the buildings there still help in some way, but at least in the steppe regions, like in the south.
Of course, there are changes in the situation at the tactical level. Weather conditions affect both sides, but let's say they reduce the capabilities of the attacking side more. And here, the actions of these so-called small groups and Putin, as well as the leadership of the Russian armed forces, are in a hurry. Because of this, in certain areas, there are examples in Dobrpilia, for instance, and in a number of other places, they are trying to use armored vehicles. On one hand, because the maintenance of road surfaces has become more difficult, and in general, what can still be called a road rather than just a direction. And, on the other hand, to carry out these actions more quickly. These actions, at what cost? They have to pay with a significant amount of losses, both in armored vehicles and in manpower. But despite this, the leadership at the tactical level is trying to fulfill the tasks set by higher command and is willing to accept such serious losses.
Igor Alexandrovich, it's interesting to discuss missiles with you, especially in light of recent events and the news about the possible or impossible deliveries of Tomahawks to Ukraine. On the one hand, Donald Trump doesn't roll them out, but on the other hand, he says they need them for themselves, so it's kind of a political game, really. It's curious. Why is the Kremlin so afraid of Tomahawks? One theory I've heard is that they're so accurate that the Kremlin is afraid, Putin in particular is afraid, that we might use Tomahawks, find his bunker, and basically break through it. And it's clear what would happen to Putin himself. Well, that's kind of in the realm of science fiction. On the other hand, experts say that Ukraine actually has its own excellent weapons developments. The same flamingos are showing great results, and if there are enough of them, they'll be able to handle the assigned targets. So, in your opinion, is the Tomahawk a symbol for the Kremlin of this new resolve from Donald Trump and the United States of America? Or is it actually their extreme precision that scares them?
The Tomahawk, depending on the number that could be supplied to Ukraine's defense forces, either serves as a weapon that exerts pressure, something Trump has been using in recent weeks, so to speak, as part of his game. If he does or does not deliver this weapon in large quantities, say, in the hundreds, then it could be a serious weapon at the operational and even strategic level. A weapon that has been tested in local wars. And one that is undoubtedly precise, because it has 3 guidance systems, and here it has advantages over our Flamingo, which is still being scaled up, and so each type of weapon has its own advantages. But the Tomahawk is already available, and there are enough of them that the Americans could easily keep some for themselves and use them as needed, and transfer some to Ukraine to solve these kinds of tasks together with our allies. But right now, we have to talk about this as a future possibility. Even if that's the case with the Tomahawks, the Americans still have enough weapons that could seriously boost Ukraine's defense capabilities, for example, by improving the capabilities of the F-16s. By providing aviation weapons for these aircraft, specifically air-to-ground missiles known as JASSM. For example, it was very important to supply a greater number of long-range surface-to-air missile systems like the Patriot systems. Of what we have, these offer the greatest range so that it would be possible to destroy aerial targets at greater distances. We need these kinds of capabilities. It would be possible to deliver RAM missiles by the end of this year or the beginning of the next, even now, in order to boost our potential. So, the capabilities exist even without Tomahawks, but the issue is a political decision, which, as we see, depends on the president, who changes his mind after every phone call, not to mention after direct meetings and conversations, like what happened in Alaska, where Trump came in with one set of plans. When it came to stopping hostilities, but left with Putin's plan, and immediately started working on an agreement that could be dragged out for this year, maybe even the next, and so on. So, for now, while we, Ukraine, are fighting, in these kinds of conditions, we need to focus on getting help right now from our true allies, and, first and foremost, on our own capabilities, developments, and the supply of weapons, including the scaling up of missile production, which is being carried out by our defense industry enterprises.
According to Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian delegation discussed a contract in Washington for the delivery of American Patriots, 25 systems. But as is well known, there is a sort of waiting list for American Patriots. So, how long could this whole process take, and is it possible for Ukraine, for obvious reasons, to move up in this queue to more realistic spots, to more realistic positions, so that to get these systems as quickly as possible?
Of course, we remember there was that statement from Trump about some 17 or 18 systems. There were announcements, but then members of his team couldn't explain where these systems would come from or when they might actually appear, and at best, it could be sometime next spring. The need to go through the process. The need for missile defense systems is obviously very great for us, but if we take Trump's statements seriously, the ones he made, we could have expected faster deliveries. But we see what's happening with the Patriot systems, with the Tomahawks, and with a number of other weapons. These kinds of approaches have led to the fact that, unfortunately, in September, arms deliveries dropped by 40% compared to previous times. And despite the fact that Trump constantly criticizes the Biden administration, during his 9 months in office, deliveries worth $1 billion were made using European money, 2 tranches of $500 million each. Meanwhile, the Biden administration was providing Ukraine with military aid worth $2 to $3 billion every 2 to 3 weeks. There is, of course, a difference. We feel it. Our defense forces are directly engaged in this war. That's why there's a struggle across a very broad spectrum to overcome obstacles, unfortunately, even from our own allies.
Subscribe to The Gaze and stay updated on the most important events, top news from Ukraine and all over the world, in-depth analysis, exclusive reports and interviews, all on hand in our channel. Join our community of viewers and stay tuned.